The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to our MWF webinar this week. My name is Tanya, and I am the marketing manager over here at Struxoft Solutions. Just before we start, just give you a little background on what MWF does. MWF is our automated Revit wall, floor, ceiling, and truss framing software for light gauge steel and also wood modeling. Today, however, Christina, our senior technician, will be covering how to detail the opening markers in both metal and wood panels, including default settings, beam pockets, and bearing headers. Just a few housekeeping items before we start. At the end of the webinar, we'll be taking a few live questions. In order to be selected, please press the raise hand button on the control panel. Just also please make sure that your audio is working correctly. If you'd prefer, you can also ask questions throughout the webinar in the questions tab of the GoToWebinar dashboard. All right, that's it for me. I'm going to pass it off to Christina now.
All right, hey everyone, good morning. Welcome to today's webinar. So for today, we're going to primarily focus on opening markers and go through some of the major ones. So I thought we'd do 3 of each. So we'll do 3 metal, 3 wood, and we'll go through the default one. We'll look at how to create beam pockets on both sides. And then we'll take a look at probably 2 of the main bearing options, namely the MultiSystem marker for light gauge and the bearing beam option for wood. So we'll take a look at both of those and just kind of work our way through the settings and see what we can do in each of those markers. So for anyone who's not familiar with opening markers at all, opening markers are basically just default settings that we load into the software. And they're the main way that we frame out our openings. So anything in this list is something that you can use on an opening. So you can use it on a window, on a door, on a plain Revit opening. And they'll have different header configurations, different ways to set up your jambs, your sills, and basically just different ways to frame out the openings. So I'm going to kind of manually apply these markers individually since we're just looking at the settings today. But again, where they really shine and where they can really help speed things along, especially in larger scale projects, is when you pair them with a rule set. So rule sets are something I actually covered in one of the first webinars way back when. So feel free to go check that one out to learn more about rule sets. But basically, if you do have rules in your project that you consistently need to follow, maybe every window condition between a certain width needs a specific header type, you can set that header type up with a marker and then apply it through a rule, save it to your templates, and your whole project will be framed out automatically without you really having to think or go through each individual opening and setting your header types. So this is where markers, specifically opening markers, can really come in handy. So we'll look at some of the main ones today. So I'm going to go ahead and start off with just the plain old default marker. And this one is actually interchangeable between metal and wood. So for anyone who just has Pro Wood or Pro Metal exclusively, you'll still have access to this marker with all of the same settings. So if I just go look at the first few options over here, basically with this marker, like I mentioned, there are options to control how that opening is framed. So there are different parameters in here to add extra cripples. We can start changing out our header alignment so you can rotate it vertically. We can do the same thing with the sills. And I'll also point out that there's a few checkboxes over here. Namely, if you want to stretch to nearest maybe. You can stretch your header and sill to the next stud over. There's a few checkboxes just to kind of configure the opening to how you need it. So I'm going to gloss over these ones today, and primarily the main thing I just want to point out with these guys is that you will notice that there are quite a bit of markers in this list, but some of them are just variations of this default. So a good example of that is just the stretch to nearest option, for example. So you can see here that there are a few commands linked with that particular setting. And there's actually a stretch to nearest marker that comes loaded in by default. And it's the exact same default marker. It just already has these guys enabled. So if ever you want to use that setting, you can just go ahead and apply it. And it'll take on those settings automatically. So I just wanted to point that out. I know it looks a little overwhelming with all those different marker types, but at the end of the day, some of them are just variations of the default. So the main thing or main things I want to point out with this default, can just jump over some of these options. The first thing I want to point out are these tolerances. So the tolerances are a nice alternative option instead of using the rough parameters in the family. If you do have families with a side light or maybe it's a pocket door, if you just want a tolerance on a particular side, then you can actually use the marker instead of modifying the family. So you can put a 6-inch tolerance, let's say on the left side in this case. We'll regenerate that, and it'll just take on that one particular side. So the tolerances exist in most markers, not just the defaults. So if ever you do want to put that rough parameter in the marker itself, we could always use the tolerances. And the last thing I'll point out in this little dropdown are the actual options to change your member sizing. So by default, you'll notice that the options here are in fact grayed out. And that is because it'll just take whatever is in your panel by default. So what I mean by that is if you do leave the parameters grayed out, it'll use whatever member types you have in your opening settings. So one of the first rule of thumbs I'll usually say in a training when we're just starting off is that when you're updating your templates, when you're changing out the different sizes, it's always a good idea just to come into this opening framing settings and make sure your header and your sill type are accurate to what's actually in the panel. And the main reason for that is just because the markers will refer to these member sizes by default. So it can come in handy if you want to use that default marker on a slew of different wall types, and it might just be a simple configuration. So you don't need to vary the member sizing. So in that case, you can just create one marker instead of creating a bunch for each different member type, and it'll just refer to what's in the panel's properties. So always a good idea to make sure that these member types are set up properly. And your king and your jacks will actually just refer to your default stud sizes. So it'll use whatever sizing you're using for your studs. So this is where you can leave this grayed out. It'll pick up whatever's in the panel. But of course, if ever you do want to customize this marker a bit more, make it more tailored, you can come to the parameters tab over here. You can enable them. You can see that the tolerances are also something that you can disable just as a safety net. And now once they're enabled, it'll actively use whatever is in this drop-down list. So then you can go ahead and specify your marker type and pick the sizing that you need. So I just wanted to point that out mainly in case it wasn't clear. By default, you can disable those parameters and it'll just use what's in the panel. So the other thing I'll just highlight before we move on to some of the other tabs, just these extra members that you can add in. So you can of course add in extra headers, you can add in extra kings if you need to, and you can specify if you want it on the left or right side of the opening. We can right click to delete and invert them. So if you do want to either delete it entirely or just flip it 180 degrees, just right click the extra members. And for your kings and your jacks on the side, there actually is an option that you can only do in the marker. You can set these up to be individual sizes. So each king can actually take on a different size if you need to. And this is only something that you can do in this default marker. It's not something we can do in just those generic opening settings. And once you are done modifying the markers, you could just hit regenerate and it'll populate. So I'll just jump over to the next tab. There's a recess grid option. So if you want to place some backing in your window, maybe for transportation, then you can always enable this grid. Can pick the member sizing in that same tab. And it's just going to give you some backing for that window. So you can also convert this into a beam pocket, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. We've got the parameters tab already covered. And the only other thing I'll mention really about this default tab is that if you do want to add a box header, it is one of the ways that you can add it. This is the same bearing option that's in the miscellaneous tab in the properties. And there's three basic configurations. You've got your type A, pretty typical box header. You can do type B, which will have them be back to back. And then type C as well, which just adds a beam brace the length of your opening. And you can make these guys either top of the opening, which will just make it a header. And you could have it be top of panel as well, and that'll make it flush with your top track. And the picture makes it super simple. All the parameters over here are just to set the different member types. And you can enable if you want a beam plate, if you want a beam cripple. There's options to place a beam angle as well. So you just can play around with this, and you could always use it for your typical box header. Last thing I'll just point out are the cutbacks for the markers. And the cutbacks themselves, there are some custom ones in the markers. In this case, it's just going to be for your actual cripples. If you want to maybe adjust the cutback length for those cripples individually, you can. But all of the cutback options for these markers will just take your cutback options here in the panels properties. So these will still apply to the markers unless, of course, there are some custom ones that will override it. But for the most part, all of your cutback options are still in this one spot. So these are the main things I wanted to highlight with that default marker. Again, some that do come out of the box are just variations of that default already set up that you can go ahead and use. But it is an easy way to get some basic framing for your openings. So the next one I'm going to talk about, we're still technically in that default marker, but we're going to look at how to create a beam pocket for a light gauge panel. So in this particular instance, if you do have some kind of beam pocket and you regenerate your wall, we will pick that up. It will just drop that piece of track. But until you apply a marker to this guy, then it's just going to frame out like this. So on the light gauge side, there isn't any default beam pocket marker that comes loaded in, but this default one does have an option to create a beam pocket. So I'm going to just duplicate this one. Let's call it beam pocket. And I'm going to go ahead and just apply it to my Revit opening. So even though we're using the default, essentially, it'll pick it up as a beam pocket just because it's cutting your top track. If it was physically underneath your top track, then we would just see this guy as a plain Revit opening and just frame it out with your default settings. But once it actually cuts your top track, that will then go ahead and activate that beam pocket tab and the settings that are in here. And the other thing that you probably picked up, I did double that king. So we're still in the default marker. These member types will still apply to a beam pocket. But just how that beam pocket is set up is something that you can come into this tab to configure. So by default, the stretch to nearest option for the beam pockets is already enabled. So maybe I'm just going to disable that, and I want to put full verticals over here to frame this guy out. The option to add verticals is already enabled, so it'll encase this guy. You can go ahead and continue your top track. If you did want to leave this as a whole piece, Even though there's that opening cutting, it'll just leave your top track whole if you did want to roll it as a singular member. And then you can go ahead and control the family type for this actual piece of sill. I'm just going to leave it to the same as my panel opening sill, but you could of course pick a member size. And let's also do full verticals. So again, they just run the full length of my panel. So let's just refresh that. We'll see how that looks. It's pretty simple. It's just essentially what I wanted. And there are some extra options in here as well. Basically, this guy down will just be to control your stretch to nearest options. But the other thing I do want to highlight, if ever you do want to add in some extra cripples over here, these cripples will just keep in line with whatever your spacing is. But you can always come over here to the jack cripple option and add in some extra cripples this way. It's a bit of a different UI, so it's going to feel a little different, but it's pretty simple. You just hit the edit, hit those three dots off to the side, and then you can just go ahead and add as many members as you need. And the main thing with this guy is that you can control if it's going to hit the center, the left side, or the right side. Maybe let's do one on the left side as well. And why not? Let's do one right in the center. So it's just going to make them perfectly flush. I've got one right smack dab in the middle, and then my two extra ones over here that are still in line with my spacing. So this is the main option that you have to create a beam pocket on the light gauge side. And again, it's just a variation of that default marker that you can duplicate and customize and change whatever you need. So the last one I want to go over for today is probably one of the main light gauge ones that we have, and that is the MultiSystem marker. So for the light gauge side, I have just been kind of primarily focusing on the default and some of the ones that are just variations of that default. But some of them are completely different and have their own set of parameters. So the truss headers are a good example of that. You'll also notice that there are some markers that are specific to manufacturers. So it'll use their header configurations, their member types. So we've got a few of those that come out of the box. But the main one I'm going to focus on is the MultiSystem marker. And basically the MultiSystem marker is if you do have any kind of built up or box header configuration that isn't just that standard type A. If there are different types of header options that you need, it'll be in this MultiSystem marker. So this is where the bulk of the bearing and the built up header configurations live. So to see the different configurations, you just have to double click on the image. And we've got the header track, which is just the pretty standard option. But we can go over, look at the box header. And if we double click on that, a few different options than just your typical type A. There's built up options as well. So pretty much, like I said, anything that's built up or isn't your standard box header will be in this multi-system marker. There's also a custom kind of interlocking option. And the last one will just actually place plates to frame out that header. So let's go with maybe that option 2. You can just double click on the picture to enable that. And then it's just setting up your member sizing. So over here, it's the same kind of idea. There's an option to override your template settings. So for this particular cripple track, you could go ahead and select your own member size, or it'll just use whatever is in your panel's properties. But let's go ahead and actually pick a size. You do have to set your actual header types, so your inner face-to-face studs over here. And then same thing for the horizontal tracks. You can override, or it'll just take your tracks from your panel's properties. So one thing I haven't really talked about yet, but there is the option to convert all of these guys into sub-assemblies. And sometimes you will have custom options to just turn maybe the header configuration into a sub-assembly. But whenever you see a general checkbox like this, it'll convert all of the opening members into one sub-assembly. So now that we've kind of set up that header, there is an option over here that'll usually enable. Again, just those general cutback settings that are in your panel's properties. You can turn that on and enable it. And then there's also custom options to change the cutbacks. So the first tab here, of course, just to make it the top of your opening. You do have an option to make it top of panel. So if you do want to make it flush with your top track, you can enable that. And then the other thing that's different with this multi-system is that if you ever need any kind of built-up sills, built-up kings, there are configurations that you can use for those member types. And this is only really something you'll find in the multi-system marker. Everything else and any other type of marker just uses your basic sill, and you can double up the kings, but there won't be any options to actually have them be built up. So let's maybe go ahead and just pick the box option. For my sill, I'm just going to do the basic sill track, but I'm going to also place my clips. I'm not going to put jack studs in this case, but same kind of idea. You can turn those on and they can be built up if they need to. There is a separate tab for tolerances for the multi-system marker. Or again, if you do have rough parameters built into the family, there is this checkbox just to enable them. And last thing I'm just going to mention in this multi-system marker, relatively new option, something called the control joint, which is basically just another option to add in some extra cripples. So you've got top and bottom cripple options that you can enable. But if I just want to turn on some top cripples, you can specify the sizing again, but I'll leave it the same size as my studs. And then you can add in as many extra cripples as you need to. And by default, they will be flush with your king, but you can always put in an offset to shift those. You can move them laterally within a wall layer. And then just some basic options here to control the cripple length. So you can leave them to full length without specifying anything. It'll just take on the regular size for your cripples. But you can add extensions. Or you could also specify a length just in reference from the top or from the bottom, which is just the header. So just some custom options to control your cripples. 3 might be a bit much. Maybe I'll just add in an extra one. And again, once you've updated that instance, we'll just say regenerate. And then it'll take on that header configuration. I've already got a section, so we can see what that looks like. Basic sill setup. And I've also got my extra cripples flush with my double kings. I've also got my clips that I set up here on the interior side. Maybe let me take this to a 3D view so it's a bit easier to see. But I have clips set up on the top and bottom. My jams are just set to that box, so they're face to face. And again, all of the cutback options for these different member types are set up through the cutbacks in your panel's properties. So unless you modify any of those cutback offsets in the marker, it'll use whatever is in your cutback settings. All right, so that's it for the light gauge side of things. Now I'm going to focus on mainly the wood ones, and these guys will not take long at all. They're pretty simple. But anyone who obviously has Pro Wood or Pro Suite as well will have access to these wood markers. And they'll have wood in the title typically, so you know which one you're using. And if I go to just the default wood opening as a good example, you can see it's got a lot of similarities to the default marker, but majority of the differences with these kind of wood specific markers are that there will be extra options to place things like nailers. So if you want some extra members, exactly what's shown in this picture to frame that out. And you've also got options for sill pads. So just a few more custom wood specific options exist in these markers, but general setup is still pretty similar. And I'll also say what is nice about most of these wood ones is that they all do come with pictures, and you'll be able to see individually what type of members you're modifying. So your typical basic opening out of the box with MWF in lumber will frame with a double header, double sill, but you can always come to this default wood one to modify that. So you can place extra headers. You can place what we call a header pad, which will just kind of underlay that header. And you could also place a double header member, I suppose, that'll just cut into your nailers. So let me maybe go ahead and add a header pad, add a sill pad, so we can see what that looks like. You've got options again to increase the number of jacks, the number of kings. And I've also got my top and bottom nailers enabled over here. And then pretty much the rest of the things are pretty simple. You can have the same amount of verticals on the left and right. If I disable that, you can again just control the left and right side of that opening. There's options for extra cripples just to make sure everything's flush. And something you can do in the wood markers as well is actually change your cripple spacing. So you can leave it consistent with just your regular studs. You can space them equally depending on the width of the opening. It'll just break them up, make sure they're all equal. You can restart it. So it'll just restart your spacing whenever it hits an opening. Or you can just have it be centered, basically places a cripple at the center and works its way out. So the same tolerance options are here, same checkbox to use rough parameters. And then all the individual member types are controlled down here. And you can actually leave them to be blank. It'll again just use what's in your panel's properties. So your headers, your jacks and your kings, and your pads. And that can be your pretty basic default wood marker. I've got my nailers over here. Got the extra header and sill pads that I put in. And I also just doubled up my sills. So just the basic wood marker with some extra options for those specific members. So last two markers. I'll just highlight for the wood side. Excuse me. You can still use the beam pocket option that's in that default marker for wood. It'll work just fine. But there is actually a wood specific beam pocket option as well. And it is geared more specifically if it falls under your top plates, but it'll actually work just the same if it does cut into your top plates. And basically you can control the number of kings, the number of jack cripples, and you also have this checkbox here to insert a filler member, which will just place it dead center over here. Same tolerance options. If you're using a window, you can use rough parameters. And then it's the same idea just to control the member sizing and the size for your filler. And it'll give you something like this. If this were to fall under your top plate, then it'll actually still place those inner members. I'm just not going to get that secondary member from where my top plate would be. So last marker to wrap up the webinar are the actual bearing options. So I've already got it applied to this larger opening here. And any of the wood bearing options will be a marker. And again, you can have it be flush with your top plate, so we can place it top of panel. Or you can place it top of window, like I have it here. And a lot of the same settings will still apply. You can still control the headers, so the number of actual headers that you have over here. And what is cool with this is that you can actually change the alignment. So if you want it centered, you can have them be spaced out, just depending on the width of your window. So let's maybe put them spaced out. And you could always increase the number of members for that header. Got your secondary kind of header sill, which is like your header pad, your additional header member. And then you could always put an extra pad. There's your traditional members off to the side over here that you can control. And then again, you can place a sill pad. So extra checkboxes as well. If you want to add in those top and bottom nailers again, you can put in short jacks as well. And there's extra cripples that'll just be flush. And once again, you can make the cripple spacing either consistent, centered, can play around with that configuration. And last option, once again, just to change out the sizing for each member type. And let's go take a look at the section view. Everything is spaced out. So these are the main options that you have for opening markers. I know I haven't touched on everything, but these are probably the main ones that you'll use for both the light gauge and the wood side. So that's it for me today. As Tanya mentioned at the beginning, if there's any questions, feel free to go ahead and ask them now.
Awesome. Thank you, Christina. I'd just like to remind everyone that if you'd like to pose a question live, please raise your hand now by clicking on the hand icon in the control panel. Just also please make sure that your audio is working correctly. While we wait for any questions to come through, I'd just like to, again, remind everyone that the recording of the webinar will be sent through shortly after the session is closed. As always, please feel free to share this recording with any colleagues. All right, we'll just give it a few more seconds. All right, Christina, it looks like we have a question from Tessa. Tessa, I'm just going to go ahead and unmute you. All right, go ahead.
Hi, yeah, I've just got a question on the light gauge steel frame. We looked at pockets through a top trap. I'm just wondering about pockets through a bottom trap and if it behaves in the same way.
So for that, it's going to depend a little bit. Let me place that on the bottom. Let's see what it does. So it actually does frame out just kind of as a traditional opening. So we're not going to recognize it specifically as a beam pocket, could equally be a door. So it'll just use those default settings. So that's why I'm getting that box header over here.
Okay, thank you.
All right, perfect. Christina, we're just going to give it another couple of seconds, see if anything's come through. Oh, we got a question that came through the dashboard from David. His question is, when using jack studs in light gauge steel openings, why do jacks extend through the header?
So that's just going to depend again on the cutbacks. So if I actually come in here, I think jack studs are defaulted to be flush with the header. But again, depending on the bearing option or what you have set up in here, it'll just take on one of these cutback settings.
Okay, perfect. All right, it looks like that's a wrap for today, Christina. For any questions that have not been answered, we'll make sure to get to them today, as well as our contact information will be available in the mailer that'll have the recording of the webinar. So if you have any questions, please feel free to email us and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. Once again, I just want to say thank you to Christina and thank you to everyone who registered for the webinar. All right, I'll now be ending it. Have a great day.